It was the winter of 1941. In the skies over China and Southeast Asia, a new shape appeared against the sun, sleek, predatory, and wearing the fierce grin of a shark. To the Japanese pilots who first encountered it, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was an enigma. It wasn't the fastest fighter they'd seen, nor the most agile, but it had a toughness, a bite, and a deadly diving attack that demanded respect. This is the untold story of how Japan sized up America's workhorse fighter, what they feared, what they mocked, and the battlefield lessons they never forgot. A fighter born in controversy. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was never supposed to be a legend. It was a compromise, an evolutionary step from the Curtiss P-36 Hawk, designed at a time when the US Army Air Corps needed a fighter fast but didn't have the luxury of starting from scratch. Instead of a clean-sheet design, engineers took the Hawk's airframe and replaced its radial engine with the liquid-cooled Allison V-1710 inline power plant. The result was a fighter that was fast in a dive, solidly built but handicapped in high-altitude performance. To some in the US, it was a good enough solution until something better came along. But to Japanese military observers, the P-40 represented something more ominous: industrial mass production on a scale Japan couldn't match. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Warhawk was already flying in Chinese colors, many of them manned by the soon-to-be-famous American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. Japanese intelligence reports in 1940–41 painted a mixed picture. The P-40 was heavy, faster than most Chinese fighters, and capable of diving away from danger with impunity. Its weaknesses were clear: poor climb rate above 15,000 feet, sluggish in tight turns, but its durability and firepower couldn't be ignored. These reports shaped Japanese tactical doctrine. Commanders instructed their pilots, never follow a P-40 into a steep dive, where its rugged construction and high-speed stability would win every time. Instead, lure it into low-speed turning duels where the Mitsubishi A6M0 or Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa could easily outmaneuver it. Still, a note of caution ran through certain dispatches. Underestimate this aircraft, and it could deliver a fatal blow. Even in its infancy, the P-40 carried the potential to be far more than a stopgap. It was a workhorse forged from compromise, but in war, workhorses have a way of becoming legends. First encounters over China. When the Japanese Army Air Force and Navy pilots first faced the P-40 in combat in late 1941, they were expecting another fragile Western fighter like the Brewster Buffalo or the obsolete Chinese Hawk biplanes. Instead, over the skies of China, Burma, and the rugged Himalayas, they met a very different beast. The P-40, especially in the hands of the American volunteer group, was flown with a mix of discipline and aggression that caught many Japanese pilots off guard. Over Kunming, Rangoon, and the winding Burma Road, Japanese formations, accustomed to dictating the fight, found themselves reacting to a foe that refused to play by their rules. The P-40 couldn't outclimb a Zero or an Oscar, but it could dive like nothing else in the theater. Allied pilots exploited this relentlessly, striking from altitude and then disappearing in high-speed dives that Japanese aircraft couldn't follow without risking catastrophic structural failure. Japanese combat reports began noting an uncomfortable trend. Bursts from the Warhawk's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns were devastating. What had been sufficient protection for Japanese bombers against lighter-armed opposition was now utterly inadequate. Even escort fighters were vulnerable if caught in a head-on pass. Pilots wrote of Warhawks absorbing shocking levels of damage, control surfaces shredded, fuselage riddled, yet still returning to base. Still, Japanese veterans adapted quickly. They instructed rookies to avoid head-on engagements, to climb above the P-40's operational ceiling when possible, and to use vertical spirals to bait it into turning fights where the Zero's unmatched agility could take over. But those first encounters left a mark. The shark mouth paint schemes of the flying tigers added to the intimidation factor, turning the P-40 into not just a machine, but a psychological weapon in the skies over Asia. Strengths the enemy respected. Despite Japan's eventual mastery of tactics against the P-40, even the most decorated Japanese aces acknowledged its dangerous strengths. It was, above all else, a survivor. The Warhawk's rugged, all-metal construction made it extraordinarily resistant to the kind of damage that would send a Zero or Ki-43 spiraling into the jungle below. This resilience allowed P-40 pilots to take risks others couldn't, risking head-on passes, executing steep dives through heavy flak, and returning home riddled with holes. Its armament was another factor that earned grudging respect. 6 synchronized 50-caliber Brownings delivered a volume of fire that could obliterate a bomber in seconds and chew through the lighter frames of Japanese fighters with terrifying ease. Allied pilots learned to exploit this by making quick slashing attacks, so-called boom and zoom strikes, before climbing away or diving back to safety. Japanese pilots knew chasing a Warhawk into a dive was a death sentence. Their aircraft simply weren't built to withstand such speeds. The Allison V-1710 engine, while criticized for its lack of high-altitude supercharging, provided exceptional acceleration in a dive and rock-solid reliability at low to medium altitudes, the very conditions under which much of the China-Burma-India air war was fought. Skilled P-40 pilots could choose the terms of engagement, striking when the advantage was theirs and disengaging when it wasn't. Aces like Saburo Sakai and Tateo Kato admitted privately that disciplined P-40 pilots, those who resisted the temptation to turn fight, were formidable. In the unforgiving chess game of aerial combat, the Warhawk's blend of speed in a dive, firepower, and survivability made it a piece the Japanese could never afford to ignore. It was not the best fighter in the sky, but it was one the enemy had to respect or pay dearly for their mistakes. Flaws they exploited. For all its virtues, the P-40 Warhawk had weaknesses that Japanese pilots learned to exploit with ruthless precision. Its biggest handicap was its climb rate, especially above 15,000 feet. In a theater where many Japanese fighters, like the Mitsubishi A6M0 and Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, thrived at altitude, this meant the P-40 could be forced into a defensive posture if caught below an opponent. Skilled Japanese pilots sought to gain height advantage and then swoop down, knowing the Warhawk couldn't match their climb to regain parity. Another glaring flaw was its turn performance. The P-40's relatively high wing loading and weight made it sluggish in tight, sustained turns. Against the agile Zero or Oscar, which could outturn almost anything in the sky, this was a death trap. Japanese doctrine evolved quickly. Force the P-40 into a turning contest, bleed its energy, and strike when it slowed. Its lack of a two-stage supercharger further limited its effectiveness at higher altitudes. Japanese bomber formations operating above 20,000 feet could sometimes evade interception entirely, as Warhawks struggled to reach them in time. Even at medium altitudes, the Allison engine's performance began to drop off, giving Japanese pilots an edge in acceleration and climb. Japanese intelligence circulated detailed diagrams of the P-40 to fighter units, marking weak spots, radiator, oil cooler, and wing route. Pilots were trained to aim for these in head-on or deflection shots. They also exploited the fact that the P-40's canopy design created significant rearward blind spots, making it vulnerable to surprise attacks from behind and below. These weaknesses didn't make the P-40 an easy kill, but they gave the Japanese a clear tactical playbook. When combined with disciplined execution and teamwork, they could turn the Warhawk's strengths into liabilities, proving that in war, knowing your enemy's limits is half the battle. Propaganda and perception. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japan's propaganda machine was quick to shape the public's perception of the P-40 Warhawk. Official reports and newsreels often downplayed its capabilities, portraying it as an outdated Western fighter outclassed by the Zero's agility and the skill of Japanese pilots. Photographs of captured or wrecked P-40s were circulated in newspapers, with captions emphasizing their supposed inferiority. Yet, within the military, a more nuanced view existed. Classified briefings acknowledged its durability, heavy armament, and dangerous diving speed. But for morale purposes, the public message had to be one of superiority. This dual narrative, mockery for the masses, respect in the war rooms, was a common feature of Japanese wartime propaganda. Still, the P-40's distinctive shark-mouth nose art, especially on Flying Tiger's aircraft, became iconic, even in Japan. It was often depicted in cartoons as a snarling beast brought down by the nimble, graceful Zero, reinforcing the David and Goliath image the Japanese press favored. The irony was that in many actual encounters, it was the beast delivering the knockout blow before slipping away in a high-speed dive. Prisoner interrogations revealed that some Japanese pilots privately admitted the Warhawk was a serious threat in the hands of a disciplined flyer. But propaganda served an important purpose. It bolstered public confidence in Japan's war effort and reassured young aviators entering combat. By framing the Warhawk as beatable, even when intelligence knew otherwise, the Japanese military maintained an illusion of total dominance, an illusion that would be harder to sustain as the war dragged on and P-40-equipped units continued to inflict losses. Tactical adaptations. The P-40 Warhawk forced Japanese pilots to adjust their long-practiced tactics. Early in the war, Japanese fighter doctrine heavily favored low-speed, close-in dogfighting, perfect for the Zero and Oscar's unmatched maneuverability. But repeated encounters with the P-40 showed that this approach didn't always work. When P-40 pilots stuck to boom and zoom tactics, they became frustratingly difficult to pin down. Japanese units began integrating altitude advantage and coordinated multi-directional attacks to trap Warhawks. Two or more fighters would engage from different angles, forcing the P-40 pilot to turn defensively, thereby sacrificing the energy advantage that made the aircraft dangerous. Others adapted by shadowing a P-40 until it committed to a dive, then cutting across to intercept its climb back to altitude. In Burma and New Guinea, where terrain dictated much of the air war, Japanese pilots learned to use cloud cover and sun positioning to negate the P-40's head-on firepower. By attacking from blind spots, especially from below and behind, they could bypass the Warhawk's formidable forward armament. Training manuals were updated to warn new pilots: never chase a P-40 straight down. Instead, climb and circle above, waiting for it to level out. Inversely, P-40 pilots learned to bait over-eager opponents into shallow dives, where the speed gap was smaller and their heavy guns could take over. This cat-and-mouse dynamic meant that by 1943, the P-40 was no longer catching Japanese pilots off guard. But it also meant that Japanese flyers respected it enough to rewrite parts of their own playbook. The Warhawk had earned a place in Japanese tactical thinking not as an invincible foe, but as one that could never be ignored. Legacy in Japanese eyes. When the war ended and Japanese pilots reflected on their experiences, the P-40 Warhawk occupied an unusual place in their memories. It was not the most feared Allied fighter. That honor often went to the F-6F Hellcat or P-38 Lightning later in the war, but it was one of the most persistent. Many Japanese veterans recalled the Warhawk as the first truly rugged, well-armed Allied aircraft they had faced in large numbers. Aces like Saburo Sakai later admitted that disciplined P-40 pilots were difficult opponents. The Warhawk taught Japanese flyers hard lessons about energy fighting, damage resistance, and the dangers of underestimating an enemy's industrial capacity. Even as newer Allied fighters appeared, the P-40 continued to see combat in secondary theaters, frustrating Japanese operations in China, Burma, and the South Pacific. In post-war interviews, some pilots described the P-40 as a soldier's airplane, not glamorous, but dependable. They respected its ability to return home riddled with holes, its stable gunnery platform, and the courage of the men who flew it aggressively despite its shortcomings. For Japanese strategists, the Warhawk was a reminder that war is as much about numbers, training, and reliability as it is about raw performance. Today, in Japanese aviation history circles, the P-40 is remembered less as a technological marvel and more as a symbol of Allied persistence. It was the fighter that appeared early, stayed late, and forced Japan to adapt again and again. In the end, the Warhawk's legacy in Japanese eyes is one of grudging respect for an aircraft that may not have been the best, but was always there, ready to fight another day. Lessons in industrial warfare. Beyond the dogfights and dive attacks, the P-40 Warhawk left Japan with a sobering realization. Modern air warfare wasn't just about building better airplanes, it was about building enough of them. Japan's aviation industry could produce fine, even world-class fighters like the Zero, but it could not match the relentless industrial output of the United States. The P-40 embodied this difference. It was not the most advanced fighter in the world, yet it appeared in theater after theater, seemingly in endless supply. By 1942, Japanese pilots noticed a pattern. Destroy a squadron of P-40s in Burma, and replacements arrived within weeks. Shoot down a handful over New Guinea, and fresh aircraft appeared before the wreckage cooled. This wasn't just demoralizing, it was strategically devastating. Every Warhawk lost could be replaced. Every experienced pilot killed could be replaced with another trained in a rapidly expanding Allied training program. The Warhawk's very presence became a constant reminder of America's ability to sustain a war of attrition. Even in secondary theaters where newer fighters like the P-51 Mustang or F-6F Hellcat took center stage, the P-40 kept fighting, escorting bombers, strafing supply lines, and defending remote airfields. For Japanese strategists, this was a harsh lesson. The P-40's endurance in the conflict underscored that a war of machines was also a war of factories. Tactical brilliance in the cockpit could win battles, but without the means to replace losses, victory in the larger war was impossible. In that sense, the Warhawk's legacy in Japan wasn't just about its combat capabilities, it was about what it represented. The industrial might of an opponent who could turn good enough into good enough to win through sheer production power. It was an edge Japan could never fully counter. In the end, the P-40 Warhawk was more than metal and machine. It was a lesson written in the skies. To Japan, it was a stubborn adversary that refused to break, a fighter that forced respect through grit, firepower, and survival. It taught pilots on both sides that wars aren't always won by the fastest or the most agile, but by the aircraft and the people that endure. From China's mountains to Burma's jungles, the Warhawk carved its place in history. And though newer fighters would eclipse it, the memory of that shark-toothed predator still lingers where the sky once roared with war.